You have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are. Faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are. Faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
Welcome to the online video teaching series from Fairmont Park Church of Christ. We're glad that you have joined us this evening. Mike Crowley is doing a series entitled Christ or Jesus in Prophecy. Mike this week has a sore throat and coughing, and it was difficult to actually do a talking session. So I'm going to fill in tonight. We're going to be in Luke 16 tonight. If you would turn to Luke 16 with me, we're going to do a lesson off the charts that I prepared today, and then Mike will continue his series, Jesus in Prophecy, next week. Luke chapter 16. There's a parable here in chapter 16 that's a very interesting passage, but also a very difficult passage to understand. I think as we look at this, sometimes there's some things that are very confusing, but I think Jesus gives us enough to understand the point that he's making, and it's a very good point to think about. This passage is the story about the main character is someone who's dishonest, untrustworthy. And what's funny is his master commends him for his actions. And not only that, Jesus uses the example of this to teach Christians how they ought to live. So that being said, you're going, okay, I'm already confused. Surely that's not right. Surely that's not correct, Tim. Well, let's look at this passage. It's a very interesting one with a great message for us. Luke chapter 16, starting with verse 1. Now he was saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager. So we see here in verse 16 that Jesus is talking to his disciples. Now in chapter 15, Jesus was teaching directly to the Pharisees because they were saying, why does this man, meaning Jesus, why does he receive sinners and why does he eat with them? And so Jesus begins to talk to them, and he tells them about the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the prodigal son. He tells them three parables. So he's speaking to the Pharisees, but disciples, meaning the 12 and others in the crowd who were following him, they heard that teaching as well. In chapter 16, we see now he was also saying to the disciples. So he began to teach directly to his disciples here, meaning the 12 and others who were following him. But we're going to see that there were some Pharisees who were listening in as well. And so we see here that there's a rich man who had a manager. Now, this manager was in these days, and even in our days today, this manager would be somebody who was an overseer of someone's business or his possessions or his property, and especially his money. It seems as though this manager was all of those things, and he would act as his masters. He would act as his proxy, his representative. He had been given authority to make business decisions, to make sales. He was giving authority over spending money, and he was trusted with this. And but he could do all these things. He was acting on behalf of the master. Wherever he went, whatever he said, it was as if his master was doing the business. So this rich man, the master, had made this man manager over all his possessions. Now, in the Old Testament, we often see people who had managers. In particular, I think of one is Abraham had a manager. His name was Eleazar, and his name comes up several times. Even Abraham was, when Isaac, after years and there was no son, Abraham was thinking the promise could go to Eleazar and his descendants. But Eleazar was entrusted of going and finding Isaac a wife and finding the right wife. He was trusted to finding that person for him, so he was a manager. Now, it's interesting studying this passage because I had recently kind of become reacquainted with a classmate of mine, and knew he had moved to Midland, but somehow we had not connected. But recently we connected, and I was visiting with him, and he has a business here in Midland, and he has done quite well. And so he was talking about not ready to retire, but he's not working that much. And in his business, he said, really, I've got people who are overseers or managers of different areas. And he was talking about 3 people that he had. He had one individual who was a manager over all his finances. He had another who was over his clients, their business clients. He was in charge of managing those. He had another man who was managing the facility and the warehouse and all the supplies and things. And he was saying, I've got to the point now that I trust these men to do these things. And he said, I go in for a little bit, for a couple of hours each day. I like to look at the financials. Sometimes I have a meeting with one of the managers, check around on other employees and talk around, but I may only spend several hours in the office each day. I've entrusted this over to other men. And so there may be many of you who understand this concept of manager. And so that's what this man was. He was a manager. He was trusted to do something. But there was an accusation made. An accusation had been coming to this master that this manager was squandering his possessions. That's an interesting word, squandering. I think the NIV uses wasting. If we went back a chapter 15 and verse 13, talking about the prodigal son, he had divided he had half of his father's estate and went off. And verse 13 of chapter 15 says at the end, he squandered his estate with loose living. So he wasted it. He mismanaged it. And so that's what this manager was accused of squandering his owner's, his master's possessions. So we see then in verse 2 that he was called in by the master and says, give an account. What have you done? You need to give an account of everything. So what's the manager going to do? Let's read. Verse 3, the manager said to himself, what shall I do since my master has taken the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig. I am ashamed to beg. I don't know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. And he summoned each one of his master's debtors. And he began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to them, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. And then he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. All right. So this manager says, what am I going to do? I'm losing my management. I'm losing my money. I'm losing my place to live. Everything is taken away from me. And he says, I'm not strong enough to dig. Now, I don't know if he was elderly, if he was an older man and it was a physical thing. I wonder, to me, if he'd squandered his possessions, that he's been living the good life. He's been eating very well, whatever he wants, and he only does what he wants, so he's probably not getting much physical activity. I'm thinking maybe he's just weak and flabby, that maybe he's just too soft, and that while he could get out and get a shovel and dig for a little bit, to dig and earn wages and to dig all day, which would have been a common job and probably an easy job to get, to earn wages, he'd go, I can't do that. I'm not strong enough to do that. And then he says, not only am I not strong enough to dig, he says, I'm ashamed to beg. Now, I think this is really ironic. He's ashamed to beg, but he's not ashamed to steal. So I don't think it was a moral thing with him about begging. I think it was he had been the representative of his master, who's very rich, evident, and probably was very well known. He had been living a life of prominence, and there was no way he could lower himself then to beg after living that kind of life. He would not be able to do that. Basically, it was an issue of pride for him. So he's like, what am I going to do? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I'm going to have no place to live, no income coming in. Verse 4, he says, I know. I've got an idea. I've got a great idea. I know what I can do. And when I do this, it's going to set me up so that when I'm out of a job, no place to live, they will welcome me into their home. They can help me get started. Now, I was going to back up, just saw a note and forgot something that I wanted to say. At the end of verse 4, verse 3, he's in a dilemma. He's about to lose his job. He is going to have no place to stay, no place to live. And yet it's his own doing, right? It is, he is reaping what he has done. In fact, I have a couple of verses written down, and I think it's good to remind us, just to stop and remind us about what this man is, the consequences that he's undergoing. In Galatians 6:7, it says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, he will reap. And then Numbers 32, God, through Moses, is speaking to the Israelites, and he says to them, your sin will find you out. You know, this man has been living a dishonest life. He's been stealing from his employer, who had entrusted him with everything. And he had been squandering those possessions. And maybe he thought he would never get caught. But as Scripture tells us, your sin will find you out. And whatever a man sows, he will reap. So many times God tells us to avoid these things, to stay away from these things for our own good. Because when we sin, when we disobey God, when we do things that are not honest, there's going to be consequences. Now, they may not come quick. They may not happen right away. I get the idea that this man had lived quite a nice life for years, squandering away his master's possessions. Whatever happened, something happened, and word got out to his master that says, your manager is mismanaging things. So our sin will find us out, and we will reap what we sow. All right, back to 4. He's got an idea. He's got an idea how to keep from being homeless and destitute here. And so what he's going to do, he said he summoned each one of his master's debtors. Now, this language here, he summoned each one of his master's debtors, sounds like there was several. We only have 2 examples, but it doesn't say he summoned both of his master's debtors, but it gives us 2 examples of what he did. So he's highly motivated to save himself from homelessness, save himself from poverty. He's highly motivated to thinking about how he can get a new start. He's got this idea that what he can do, that people will owe him, and they will welcome him into his home. And here's what he does. He begins to say to each one of the debtors, how much do you owe my master? Well, one of them said, I owe him 100 measures of oil. Now, we translate this measures. The Greek word is pronounced bath, and a measure or a bath of oil usually is 8 or 9 gallons. This would be oil from olive trees, olive oil. This would be the oil that comes from that. And so if it was 100 measures of oil, it would be about 800 or 900 gallons of oil that had been pressed into containers. And this would, just kind of reading, taking somebody's word for it, be about 3 years of wages, a regular man's wages, what was owed here. And so he says, okay, verse 6, he says, then take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. He's basically saying, if you'll pay this right now, I'll give you'll only have to pay 50% of what you owe. I'm cutting your bill in half. Now, interesting that he says quickly. He knows the methods of sale. You've got to get the customer to make a decision fast. You don't let them have too long to make a decision, or they might decide not to do it. So he's putting the pressure on them. You need to do this quickly. We've had, I think of 2 things of examples of that, where one of us has had a hospital stay. We get all the insurance done and paid, and then they say, this is what you owe. And if it's a bill that's going to be a couple of $1,000s or more, I remember a time that they said, this is what you owe. You can either make payments, or if you can pay this, we will cut it down like almost 1,000. If you can pay this now, we will take this. If you're going to make payments, you're going to have to pay the full amount. But if you can pay this now, we did everything we could to save $1,000. We moved money around. We found ways to pay that then, so we wouldn't have to make these long payments and end up paying more. And then I thought about whenever we're into a big city that has a Major League Baseball team, I'm wanting to go see the game. Well, now you can't call the front office of the league or of the Major League team. They divvy out all their tickets to these services, or either the services buy all their tickets. And then so you have to go through them. So you go out and you pick your seat. And then when you pick it, it says it's going to be this much, and there's this timer. you have $10 to pay for it, or they don't guarantee those seats. They could be taken, before you make the decision. So you see this clock up there, and all of a sudden you go, oh, okay, is this the best deal? Anyway, so he's saying quickly, do this quickly. And then he goes to another and says, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he says, all right, take your bill and write 80. He's giving him 20% off. And this 100 measures of wheat, the word for that's translated measure here actually means core. It's about, I'm trying to remember what that was. It's about 100, this 100 core would be about 1,000 bushels of wheat, which I'm told would take about 100 acres to produce. So it's a pretty big bill. And he said, instead of 100, you pay 80. Now, I'm not sure how these debtors did it. They may have been like my wife and I when we got a big break on a hospital bill. We found a way to do it. Maybe the manager knew that they could move money around instead of just paying this bill in installments. They knew that if he gave them a deal that they would find a way to pay it. And so instead, he's doing something. And the reason he's doing this, you remember why? It's so that he will be in good with them. The debtors will be grateful for him. And then when he needs a favor, they're indebted to him. When he needs a place to stay, when he needs some help to get a new start in life without digging ditches or begging, they were going to be obligated because of the favor that he's done about them. So they're happy. But what about the master? How does the master feel about this? Well, he's already displeased with him because he's found out that he's been squandering his possessions. And then he's going to find out that this man, instead of getting his to pay full, he's gotten them to pay 50%, the other 80%. And then he's writing them a receipt that says paid in full. Now remember, this manager has all authority as if he was the owner. So when he writes paid in full, it's a done deal. There's nothing that the master, the owner, can do about it because he still has that right to act on his behalf. So when he does that, you think now he's going to be doubly mad, right? Have you ever had somebody rip you off? Somebody to do something not right that cost you money? It's a terrible feeling. You can lay awake for many nights thinking about how do you fix this? What can you do to make that person pay for what he's done? Well, how does the master respond? Let's look at verse 8. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. What? He had acted shrewdly? The master praised him? This word, Greek word that's translated shrewd here is the word phronimos, and it means clever, wise, prudent. And so this master, looking through worldly eyes at his worldly manager, who's trying to save his hide to keep from being out begging or digging ditches, he says, wow, this man was clever. He was wise. I respect that. And then Jesus, this has to be Jesus who's saying the second part. He's telling the story. He's saying the master praised him. The second half of this verse, Jesus says, for the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. Why would Jesus say that? What does he mean by that? Well, I'm going to jump in, and I think you'll see this as we go. I think Jesus is saying here is that people in the world are wiser, more prudent, more determined about securing their future than the sons of light. He's saying people in the world will use any means available to them to secure their worldly future. I believe Jesus is saying if believers were as determined in their spiritual lives about spiritual things and their eternal future as unbelievers who are in their physical, temporary world, how much influence, what could believers do in the world around them if they spent that same amount of drive and passion and pursuit in their future? You think about it, I think about businessmen. Have you ever seen businessmen in an airport before they get on the plane? They're making calls, they're working, they're trying to do last minute things before they get called on the plane and have to turn off all their devices. They're very driven in their business. What about athletes? The world-class athletes, professional athletes, they train meticulously, regularly. They watch their diet. They have drive and passion to accomplish maybe good things, but certainly things that don't last in this world and certainly eternally. Let's look at verse 9. Let's continue to look, and maybe we can understand what Jesus is saying. And he said, I say to you, make friends for yourself by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into their eternal dwellings. Now, Jesus is going to use a technique here that he has used before. It was often a technique of rabbis and their teaching as well, and that is you teach from the lesser to the greater. Let me give you an example. Remember when Jesus said, if you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? In other words, he's saying, if you do this for your children, how much more will God, who is the giver of good gifts, who's holy and good, who doesn't sin, how much more will he give to those who ask? Jesus is making this comparison, saying if people in the world pursue after worldly things with passion and drive, how much more should those who are believers, who have experienced grace and the salvation, should they pursue after spiritual things? Let's look back to Matthew, and I think we can understand this even better. Matthew chapter 6. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 6. We're going to look at a couple of verses here that I think it explains what Jesus is saying. It's important for the Christian and how he lives his life. Matthew chapter 6, let's look at verse 19 first. Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now, same chapter, look to verse 31. Do not worry then, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. When we look at, as Jesus continues to teach, as we look and add to these teachings from Matthew, we see that Jesus here is saying, the world can pursue after worldly things with drive and passion. Christians, believers, followers, pursue after spiritual things with passion. All right, let's continue to read. Verse 10, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? Who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? This is a continual thing of we're in a world, we have riches. We can't escape that money is a part of how we purchase things. It's a part of our market system. And I don't mean just in the United States, but in the world. It's part of how we do things. If you cannot handle such a thing that is temporary, we can't take riches, worldly goods with us to heaven. You know what they say. You never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. If Christians can't be faithful and sensible and wise and clever about those things, how will they be trusted with the true riches of spiritual things? And so we have to have the proper attitude that we know we deal with material things in this world, but we have to have the proper attitude to them. Our drive and our pursuit should be after those things that give us treasures in heaven, those things that are about the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus reminds him, verse 13, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Be careful of the promises that wealth and possessions make, because if you believe that they provide you with true security, true happiness, you will begin to serve them. But they are a path to emptiness and disappointment. People in this world will pursue them with passion. How much more should those of us who have tasted the light, tasted the goodness of God, pursue the spiritual things? Jesus tells a parable about a worldly boss praising a worldly manager for his drive and pursuit for worldly security and worldly things. Jesus is not saying that's where we should be. He is contrasting that. Chapter 15, he's comparing things of the world to God's love. But now we're seeing a parable of contrast. That if the world pursues after worldly things that are temporary, that are going to disappoint, that will not provide what they promise, then how should we, as stewards and managers of the gift of salvation, the gift of grace, the life we have living under that grace, how should we manage that? Should we not manage at least as much with drive and passion and pursuit to those things that are true treasures in the kingdom of heaven?
The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive.